October 31st, 1956, British, French, and Israeli troops invade Egypt in what would prove to be a futile and unpopular attempt to wrest control of the Suez Canal from Egypt. Just 6 weeks earlier, thanks to the Suez Canal Base Agreement, British troops left Egypt after 72 years of British occupation. The treaty also addressed the issue of the canal, which traversed Egyptian territory. The 100-mile-long canal had originally been built by the French in 1869. At the time of the troop withdrawal in 1956, Egypt had sold all its interest to England, and the Suez was completely owned by the British government and French stockholders. The original charter stipulated that control of the canal belonged to the builders until 1968, but that agreement was breached by Egyptian President Nasser. Angered by the United States and England's refusal to fund a major new development project, Nasser decided to retaliate.
The Suez Canal, never far from the news in its 87 years of history, hits the headlines like a bombshell when, without a hint of warning, Egypt's Premier, Colonel Nasser, announces that his country is taking it over. The profit is to be used to complete the Aswan Dam, the huge project from which Britain and America recently withdrew their offers of financial aid.
The seizure of the canal not only meant the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars, but also threatened the vital interests and economic lifeblood of its two largest users, England and France. Most of the oil for both countries passed through the canal, as well as a large part of their trading and consumer goods. The canal crisis added an explosive fuse to an already volatile Arab-Israeli situation in the Middle East. After 3 months of futile negotiations and international pressure, the ticking bomb finally exploded.
The Suez crisis burst dramatically into the news again, for Israel has invaded Egypt. Britain and France have declared the canal in danger, and British and French troops are on the move.
When the Suez War finally erupted, it did so on two fronts. First, with an Israeli blitz across the Sinai Peninsula, followed by a British-French assault against the Suez Canal itself. Although it was denied at the time, all three countries had joined in planning the invasion. The Egyptian army was no match for the combined invading forces. Israel controlled the whole of the Sinai within a day, and the Anglo-French forces quickly captured the canal. The international outcry against the invasion was swift. The United States was harshly critical of its traditional allies and led a censure movement at the United Nations.
Delegates returned to the UN for the first emergency General Assembly ever called. The unprecedented session brings U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles from Washington with Ambassador Lodge. Dulles comes prepared to offer a resolution formulated after consultation with President Eisenhower. A long list of delegates take the rostrum in hours-long debate on the resolution. The U.S. turns to the United Nations as it did in Korea to preserve peace throughout the world.
The resolution was passed, and fighting came to an end 7 days after it began. 2 weeks later, UN troops moved into the canal zone, where they would remain as a peacekeeping force for the next 10 years. Egypt suffered greatly during the fighting. Casualties were high, and Port Said was all but leveled. The canal was rendered unusable for months. Egypt was forced to pay $81 million in restitution to canal stockholders, but the canal was theirs. Israel was also forced to return all of the territory it had captured. Thanks to the UN, Egypt turned a military defeat into a major political victory. November 4th, 1956, at dawn, 1,000 Soviet tanks rolled into the center of Budapest to put down a revolt which had brought hope, freedom, and a new style of government to the people of Hungary. The rise against Soviet rule had begun some weeks earlier.
This is how it all started, with a peaceful students' demonstration 100,000 strong. They carried pro-communist banners. No one spoke of rebellion. All they asked was greater democracy within the present regime. But meanwhile, on the radio, Party Secretary Guerreau was describing the demonstrators as rabble. And the word was like a burning match in a powder barrel. All the pent-up emotions of a decade, all the hatred of Russian interference flared up at once. Budapest became a battleground.
For the first time since the communist takeover at the end of World War II, the Hungarian national flag was openly displayed, and the hated red flags were burned. Partisans were joined by elements of the Hungarian army, and when they weren't fighting alongside, the soldiers often handed over their weapons to the revolutionaries, including their tanks. What started as a small anti-Soviet protest erupted into a full-fledged war. While some hardline members of the Hungarian Politburo wanted the Soviets to help put down the rebellion, others advocated compromise. There were now hundreds of thousands of people marching through the streets of Budapest. At first, Premier Imre Nagy seemed to support the revolution, but soon he was directing the secret police against his former supporters. Even as Russian officials were publicly negotiating the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Budapest, plans for a full-scale attack on the rebels were being drawn up in Moscow. The velvet glove was about to be removed from the iron fist. The brutality of that fateful day not only helped bring dissident Hungarians to heel, it also brought condemnation from around the world and censure from the United Nations. After 8 weeks of valiant resistance, Hungary's patriots were faced with the inevitability of Soviet might. Over 50,000 were killed in the fighting. Premier Nagy was executed for having initially voiced sympathy for the revolutionaries' cause. Despite the brutal crushing of the revolution, the people of Hungary would not give up. It would take 30 more years, but they would finally gain their freedom.